Number 11. Julie Jensen. Julie Jensen and her husband Mark seemed like a typical middle-class American couple living in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. They both held steady jobs, shared 2 sons, and resided in a charming neighborhood. Yet behind closed doors, their marriage was far from perfect. In 1991, while Mark was away on a business trip, Julie engaged in an affair with a colleague. Although they spent a weekend together at the Jensen's house, Julie felt guilty and ended the romance shortly after. Mark eventually found out about the infidelity, but the couple chose to stay together. During the affair, Julie confided in her lover about her husband's bizarre and concerning behavior. She claimed to have found a recording device inside their home. And after the cheating incident, those close to Mark noticed alarming changes in his demeanor. A colleague even testified about finding a notebook on Mark's desk filled with drawings of male genitalia. Around the same time, the Jensen household was plagued by a series of harassing notes containing perverted drawings and explicit images. And this continued for 7 long years. In 1998, Julie handed an envelope to a friend instructing him to give it to the police if anything happened to her. She expressed fear that Mark might poison or inject her with something harmful. Julie disclosed finding syringes in a drawer after Mark encouraged her to drink red wine. She also stumbled upon suspicious notes that Mark had written and discovered poison-related pages in the family computer's internet search history. Julie shared a similar warning with another friend, making it clear that if she died, she didn't take her own life. She also said that if anything happened to her, Mark should be the prime suspect. Alongside the discoveries within their home, she mentioned Mark's increasing emotional distance and obsession with spending time on the computer after work. Julie's friends were deeply concerned for her well-being. The once lively and energetic 42-year-old was now chronically fatigued and experiencing significant weight loss. Then tragically, just weeks after expressing her fears about Mark's intentions, Julie was found dead in her bed. The day after her death, Julie's neighbor handed the envelope containing crucial materials she'd given him to the police. It included a handwritten note addressed to local detectives. In the letter, Julie revealed her affair and Mark's unforgiving nature, attaching a shopping list from Mark's daily planner with syringes and chemicals on it. She asserted that she was a non-smoker and only drank alcohol occasionally, but Mark had been pressuring her to drink more at night. Julie adamantly denied any intention of taking her own life and listed her regular medications. She concluded the letter with a hope that she was wrong, but expressed her fear that Mark might kill her, emphasizing that her children were the reason she hadn't left the marriage. To the shock of many, Julie's autopsy revealed the presence of antifreeze in her system. Mark attempted to pass it off as if Julie had taken her own life, even displaying inappropriate behavior and laughter at her funeral. Soon after, he quickly emptied the house of Julie's belongings, and it was later discovered that he'd been having an affair of his own with a co-worker named Kelly Labonte, which had started several months before Julie's death. Kelly moved in with Mark almost immediately after Julie's belongings were discarded, and the two married the following year. Mark faced murder charges, but he'd persistently maintained his innocence during the 2002 trial, sticking to his claim that Julie had taken her own life, despite her clear warnings about his actions. However, justice was finally served in 2008 when Mark was convicted of Julie's murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Although he managed to secure a retrial through a series of appeals in 2021, he was once again found guilty and sentenced to life behind bars in 2023. Number 10. Michelle Rowling. In November 2013, 25-year-old Michelle Rowling posted an alarming status on Facebook stating, "If anything happens to me tonight, just let my kids know I love them dearly and tell my mama I love her." At the time, her ex-boyfriend, 25-year-old Montrell Cooper, had just been released from jail after spending several months behind bars for allegedly assaulting her. And beneath the original post, she made an ominous comment about how she'd be gone by the time police arrived. 5 days after Michelle made the post, police were called to her apartment in East St. Louis, Missouri, over reports of a disturbance. Unfortunately, they arrived to find her suffering from multiple stab wounds. Michelle was then taken to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead. By the time police arrived at the scene, Cooper was nowhere to be found. but he turned himself into authorities 6 days later and was charged with murder. Cooper pleaded guilty to the charge and was subsequently sentenced to 50 years in prison. Family members told local station KTVI that Cooper had threatened to kill Michelle during his time in jail. They said he couldn't accept that Michelle was done with the relationship and wanted to move on with her life. Oddly though, she'd testified in Cooper's favor in a previous assault case from the year before when he was accused of stabbing her in the neck. As a result, Cooper walked free on probation. According to the prosecution, the state had sought prison time in the more recent assault case, but Michelle was uncooperative and Cooper was once again released on probation. Number 9. Alice Matthias. Alice Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with her daughter, 24-year-old Morel Matthias, after the young woman's ex-boyfriend was released on bail amid an ongoing domestic violence case in early 2023. So, unable to ignore her instinct, Alice went to 36-year-old Aaron Romo's apartment in Anaheim, California. She then entered the residence through the unlocked front door and found her daughter dead in the bathroom. And while Morel's cause of death hasn't been revealed, authorities concluded that she was murdered. Morel's family members told local station KTLA that Romo had a history of abuse and that they'd sought an order of protection in late 2022. Around the same time, Romo was charged with a slew of domestic violence-related crimes, including 1 felony count each of corporal injury on a spouse or cohabitant and false imprisonment. He was also charged with misdemeanor counts of resisting arrest and battery, but at the time of Morel's death, the case was pending in the court system. Anaheim police arrested Romo 4 days after the young woman's body was found. He's currently being held without bail on a murder charge. Authorities have released limited details about the case, but said that they believe Romo has assaulted other women in the past. They also encouraged any previous victims to come forward. Number 8. Charlene Wakasaka. It was no secret to Charlene Van Gundy's daughters, Tammy and Tiffany, that their mother suffered from psychiatric problems. They always hoped she'd find happiness, though, and they thought that had finally happened when Charlene married a man named Ken Wakasaka during the 1990s. By then, Tammy and Tiffany had relocated to the US mainland, while Ken and Charlene built a life together in Hawaii. For a while, it seemed like the marriage was going well, but over time, signs began to emerge that things weren't so great between the couple behind closed doors. During a phone call in January of 2000, Charlene allegedly told Tiffany that Ken had threatened to blow up Tiffany's and Tammy's houses. And the following month, she made her daughters promise to investigate if anything ever happened to her. Tiffany would later testify that when she spoke to her mother several weeks later, Charlene accused Ken of taking out a life insurance policy in her name without telling her. And around the same time, she told her daughters to go to her house and ask for their baby pictures if anything ever happened to her. During the early morning hours of April 5, 2000, Charlene told Tammy and Tiffany that she'd taken some pills. Her speech was slow and slurred, with pauses between words. Then she told Tammy that she was dying, prompting her daughter to call the police in Hawaii and ask for an ambulance to be sent to Charlene's house. Several hours later, Tiffany called her mother's house and learned that Charlene hadn't gone to the hospital. Ken allegedly told Tiffany that Charlene was fine, but when she spoke with her mother, her speech was still unusual. The daughters would later claim that when they questioned Ken about why their mother didn't go to the hospital, he said that she was just drunk and needed to sleep it off. They would also accuse Ken of saying that he and Charlene could work out their problems and to stay out of it. Several hours later, paramedics responded to a second emergency call at the Wakasaka's home. But by the time they arrived, Charlene had collapsed on the floor and her lips were turning blue. So they rushed her to the hospital, where she was placed on life support. Tiffany and Tammy flew to Hawaii to be at their mother's side and to investigate their suspicions of Ken abusing her. While Charlene fought for her life in the hospital, the sisters discovered pill bottles in the bushes outside the Wakasaka's home. They also asked Ken for their baby pictures, and he found an envelope that was labeled accordingly and handed it over to the sisters. In it, they found notes, allegedly in Ken's handwriting, from what appeared to be an anger management class. The notes appeared to reference past violent episodes and admissions of abuse against Charlene. 5 days after being rushed to the hospital under mysterious circumstances, Charlene was taken off life support and passed away. Ken adamantly denied any wrongdoing, even after an autopsy ruled that Charlene was strangled to death. The medical examiner also ruled out the possibility of a fatal heart attack or overdose. In 2002, Ken was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Then, 3 years later, his conviction was overturned based on prosecutorial misconduct. Ken was facing a retrial when his lawyer discovered that the grand jury who originally indicted him didn't get to hear from a witness they requested testimony from. The witness was a roommate of Ken's who claimed to overhear Charlene asking him to stay by her side on the day she died. It was enough to get the case against Ken dropped entirely, and he remains a free man to this day. The only way to prosecute him in the future would be to secure a new indictment. Charlene's daughters have remained dedicated to seeing that happen, while Ken continues to stand by his claims of innocence. Number 7. Promise Edwards. When 18-year-old Jacob Williamson showed interest in meeting an online acquaintance in 2023, his friend Promise Edwards felt a gut instinct that something was amiss. Recently, Jacob had come out as transgender and faced resistance from some family members. Seeking support, he moved into Edwards' home in Lawrence County, South Carolina. Emotionally burdened, he was trying to find a positive path in life. After weeks of communicating with someone named Josh Newton, Jacob decided to take their connection to the next level and meet in person. Edwards worried about his safety and suggested the Life 360 safety app for tracking and quick communication in case of emergencies. Concerned about Jacob's well-being, Edwards spent several days with him, devising a safety plan. Despite her worries, though, Jacob reassured her that Josh was a nice guy and that they shared many interests. On the day of the meeting, Josh Newton picked up Jacob, planning to visit an amusement park hours away. However, Edwards became increasingly anxious when she noticed Jacob's location frequently changing on the Life 360 app, and when his location was eventually turned off, she decided to involve the police. The search for Jacob proved distressing, and 5 days later, law enforcement discovered his body near a roadside in Pageland, South Carolina, close to the North Carolina border. The authorities have confirmed that Jacob was murdered, and they suspect Josh Newton to be the perpetrator. According to the police, Newton took Jacob to his trailer in Monroe, North Carolina, where the murder occurred. The 25-year-old suspect is now facing charges of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice, while his live-in girlfriend, 22-year-old Victoria Smith, has been charged with obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. However, the prosecutors have yet to disclose the cause of Jacob's death or the alleged motive behind this tragic and senseless act of violence. Sometimes when a person seems like the perfect match, it's because they're manipulating or deceiving their target. And while others tend to pick up on this from the outside looking in, it's hard to convince a love-struck young person not to dive headfirst into a relationship with someone they may not even know very well. Number 6. Santa Wikra. After starting his career as a lawyer, Santa Wikra dabbled in politics before moving on to journalism. He eventually became one of the highest-ranking and most respected journalists in Sri Lanka, where he started the popular English-language Sunday Leader newspaper during the 90s. He also advocated fiercely for human rights. At the height of Santa's career, his level of influence began to scare high-ranking politicians and leaders. The Sunday Leader and other newspapers he founded were highly critical of the government, yet they were some of the country's most popular independent news sources. People were listening to what Santa and like-minded contributors had to say, and the writer's material exposed high levels of government corruption that those in power didn't want people to find out about. Politicians from various parties tried to win over Santa's favor by offering him ministry positions, and at the same time, he and others at his publications received death threats over their revealing exposés. Santa was tried for libel in 2000 after criticizing the country's president, but he managed to avoid severe penalties. In 2008, then Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa allegedly called the journalist up to his office and threatened that he'd be killed if he didn't change the nature of his newspaper's coverage. It was no secret to Santa and others that he had a target on his back. But he didn't want to put anyone in harm's way, so he refused to hire a bodyguard. But in early 2009, Santa was fatally shot while driving to work, and he died from his injuries. 3 days after his death, An obituary that Lasantha had written for himself appeared in the paper. It talked about how the government had waged war on the independent media and how those in power were silencing journalists by harassing, threatening, and murdering them. He predicted in the obituary that the investigation into his death would fail to go anywhere, and he ended up being right. While Lasantha's death caused an international uproar, Sri Lankan authorities didn't seem too eager to get to the bottom of the case, and many people continue to believe that former President Mahinda Rajapaksa ordered the hit. Then in 2022, a Netherlands-based international human rights organization known as the People's Tribunal on the Murder of Journalists concluded that the Sri Lankan government was responsible for Santa Wikra murder. Number 5. Joan Watkins. Around 8 a.m. one Saturday in January 2015, a passerby discovered the body of a young man in an alleyway in Joliet, Illinois. It initially appeared as though the victim, identified as 24-year-old Michael Brock, had been killed in a hit-and-run. But a closer look at his remains revealed that he'd been shot and then struck by a vehicle. Investigators were interested in talking with Brock's girlfriend, 24-year-old Chinasisha Hill King, whose vehicle matched debris found at the murder scene. The young woman's abandoned car was also discovered nearby, but the police never got the chance to question her. 2 months after Brock's murder, Hill King's bullet-riddled body was found in a ditch. She was reportedly frozen solid and appeared to have been there for a long time. Detectives believed that Hill King may have had something to do with Brock's death, but they were unable to speculate beyond that when it came to her suspected role in the murder and how involved she allegedly was. Hill King vanished at the same time as Brock, also posing the possibility that the couple died at the hands of the same person or group of people. Shortly after Hill King's body was found, a 58-year-old local resident named Joan Watkins told Patch News that she knew the young couple were bound for a bad end. She said that her husband met Brock on the streets and welcomed him into their home, believing he could set his life on the right path with some guidance. Shortly after Brock moved in, Hill King also started staying there, even though she hadn't been invited to move in. Watkins claimed that the pair were drug users and heavy drinkers who stole liquor from local stores and charged porn movies to the Watkins cable bill. And when Joan tried getting Hill King to leave, she said the young woman outright refused. During the tumultuous time at the household, Hill King accused Watkins of slashing her face. Police arrested Watkins, although authorities ultimately decided not to pursue the case. So, Watkins languished in jail for 28 hours, while the couple allegedly stole her TV, medication, jewelry, expensive silverware, and other valuable items. But when she returned home, she was just relieved that Watkins and Hill King were gone. And when she spoke with the press after their deaths, she expressed sympathy that the two troubled young adults lost their lives at such a young age, stating, "I hate that she got killed, but I knew something bad was going to happen." And to this day, the murders appear to remain unsolved. Number 4. Cindy Pepper. Toward the end of 2021, it became clear to 36-year-old mother of 4 Chantal Lebrun that her relationship with her husband, Kevin Ramage, wasn't going to work. It had been falling apart for months, and Chantal had told friends and family that Kevin had installed cameras throughout the house they shared in Smiths Falls, Ontario. She also claimed that Kevin had started tracking her with GPS devices. The final straw came when Chantal found a GPS tracker under the floor mat in her car and home surveillance footage showing Kevin putting it in there. Chantal said she wanted a divorce, and Kevin began crashing on the couch while claiming that he was looking for somewhere else to live. In the meantime, Chantal started seeing a new partner. Her mother, Cindy Pepper, had a bad feeling about Kevin still living at her house, but Chantal reassured her mom that she was fine and that Kevin would be leaving soon. Unfortunately for her, though, she was very wrong. On Christmas Day, Chantal spent time with her new boyfriend, but later that night, Kevin showed up at a local police station and allegedly confessed to killing Chantal during a fight that spiraled out of control. He was charged with first-degree murder and later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, which comes with a life sentence in Canada. Typically, a person convicted of the charge becomes eligible for parole after 10 years, but authorities agreed that Kevin Ramage will have to serve at least 16 years before he has any chance of seeing freedom. Sometimes family members and friends turn out to be right about a loved one's partner being bad news, but they're also wrong a lot of the time. If a majority of the people in your life were suspicious of a partner you considered trustworthy, and they couldn't pinpoint exactly why they felt that way, would you start to reevaluate your relationship, or would you write it off as well-intending but meritless paranoia? Let us know in the comments below. Number 3. Homicidal horror. 26-year-old Annie E. struggled with some issues, but she worked and felt ready to be independent from her seemingly overbearing family. So in 2013, she moved in with her friend Tan Huai Zen and Tan's husband, Pua Hak Chuan, in the Woodlands area of northern Singapore. Annie's family cautioned her against the decision because they thought Tan Hu Zhen was manipulative, and they even tried persuading Annie to stop speaking to him. But she wanted to be on her own, and there was no talking her out of moving. At first, the new living arrangement worked out fine. Tan and Pua allowed Annie to stay with them for free while she got on her feet, and she contributed by helping out around the house. But the harmonious environment was soon overtaken by chaos when bedbugs infested the home. Annie had recently moved in, so Tan and Pua blamed her for the infestation, and the seemingly welcoming hosts suddenly became cruel and highly abusive. The torment began with daily beatings for Annie's alleged bad behavior, which included things like using the shower for too long or supposedly lying. And over time, the beatings became longer and more intense, lasting for up to 2 hours at a time. The couple forced Annie to confess to doing things wrong and promised to change, and they routinely beat her across the backside with a roll of saran wrap so that the injuries wouldn't be visible. But people noticed that something unusual was going on at the home. One neighbor later told Channel News Asia that they'd seen injuries on Annie, including bruises and a swollen face. But they didn't ask Tan and Pua about the young woman's well-being, and they also didn't raise the alarm in any other way. The neighbor was intimidated by the couple, who they said had tattoos and looked like gangsters, and they also felt that they didn't have enough evidence to even be asking questions. They came to regret their decision to stay silent, though, in April 2015, when Annie died from the prolonged abuse she'd suffered at her former friend's hands. Tan and Pua tried claiming that she'd taken her own life, stating that she'd become covered in visible bruises and other injuries simply because she was clumsy. However, an investigation quickly began to turn up signs of horrific abuse, forcing the couple to confess to hurting Annie. In the weeks leading up to her death, she was so weak that she struggled to walk, stand, and breathe normally. She also lost control of her bladder and began urinating on herself. After noticing how close to death Annie was, Tan and Pua decided to take a break from beating her so she could recover. But just 2 days later, they went right back to abusing the young woman. Annie died with 12 fractured ribs, 7 fractured vertebrae, and a ruptured stomach, and she was covered in bruises and blisters. Her cause of death was classified as acute fat embolism. During the beatings, the blunt force impact from the strikes and blows caused fatty tissue to enter Annie's bloodstream. While the condition rarely results in death, in Annie's case it traveled to her lungs and caused a blood vessel blockage which interfered with her circulation, ending in cardiac and respiratory failure. In hindsight, the neighborhood witnessed some of Annie's injuries said that they wished they would have approached her and offered to help, and that maybe it would have saved her life. And while the family had suspected that something bad was going to happen, Annie was an adult and they'd respected her wishes for space and freedom. Tan and Pua were initially charged with murder, but when the prosecution failed to establish a solid motive or prove that the couple meant to kill Annie, their charges were reduced to voluntarily causing grievous hurt with a dangerous weapon. And in the end, the court sentenced Tan Hui Zhen to 16 years in prison, while Pua Hak Chuan received a 14-year sentence and 14 strokes of the cane. Number 2. Patricia Kimball. Just when 26-year-old Patricia Kimball was about to give up on finding love, her cousin's ex-boyfriend Ted Kimball began showering her with attention. They dated for a little more than a year before marrying in 1994. In October 1995, less than a year and a half after Ted and Patricia exchanged their vows, the couple's house caught fire. Patricia's lifeless body was found inside the burned-out home, but investigators quickly discovered evidence that the fire had been started deliberately using gasoline, and this led them to suspect that it wasn't the fire that killed her. And an autopsy revealed that Patricia died from a gunshot wound to the head before the blaze broke out. The home appeared ransacked at first glance, but nothing valuable appeared to be missing, indicating that the killer had another motive. Almost everyone in Patricia's life had an alibi, including Ted, who told investigators that he was at work when he found out that his wife hadn't shown up for a Bible study she was supposed to be at. He called a friend to check on her, and the ensuing chaos unfolded. Ted's co-workers verified his whereabouts, and detectives were initially left without any strong suspects. Patricia's friends noticed that her car was parked as if another vehicle had been in the driveway, suggesting that she knew her killer or she wouldn't have entered her house. This was especially true considering how the home had been burglarized twice. The first break-in was unsolved at the time of Patricia's death, and the suspect in the second burglary was in jail. Investigators began to take another look at Ted after discovering that he and Patricia's marriage wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. Ted allegedly lived beyond his means, and when Patricia found out that he'd forged her signature on a $200,000 life insurance policy and hadn't told her about it, she wondered out loud to a friend if her husband was planning to knock her off. In her journal, she'd written that Ted was becoming distant, and she became increasingly concerned for her safety in the weeks leading up to her death because Ted started sleeping with a gun under his pillow. She then warned her friends that if anything happened to her, that the police should look at her husband. Detectives soon discovered that Ted's brother Ronnie had been in the area on the day of Patricia's murder rather than the military base where he was stationed. Ted never mentioned spending time with Ronnie during questioning, and Ronnie was loyal to his big brother to a fault. He refused to take a polygraph, and the investigation stalled until 1997, when a military buddy of Ronnie's, Mitch Whidden, came forward and revealed that Ronnie had confessed to Patricia's murder in detail. According to Whidden, Ronnie had admitted to waiting in Patricia's bathroom for her to come home. He then shot her as she walked past the bathroom door. As a result, Ted and Ronnie were charged with murder, and they were both convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And now for number 1, but if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Carol Dowd. A family member's worst fear came true in 2014 when Carol Dowd received a phone call at 3 a.m. about her sister, 53-year-old Patricia Santana. Patricia worked as a school teacher and lived in Jersey City, just across the East River from Manhattan. She'd been stabbed to death, and a friend was phoning Dowd to give her the tragic news. Dowd later told the Jersey Journal that when she learned of her sister's murder, Patricia's ex-fiancé, Michael Humphrey, immediately came to mind as the person she believed was responsible. According to relatives, Patricia and Michael dated for 7 years, but after breaking up with Michael at the end of 2013, Patricia ended up taking him back. Carol warned Patricia that she was worried about her safety, later telling NJ.com that she thought Michael was too quiet to the point of being antisocial. Something about his demeanor was just off-putting, and Carol couldn't shake the feeling that something bad would eventually happen. When Patricia was murdered, she'd recently broken up with Michael for a second time, but was kind enough to let him crash on the couch until he made other living arrangements. So once again concerned for her sister's safety, Carol warned Patricia to be cautious. Unfortunately, Patricia didn't seem to sense the same danger that Carol felt. She told her sister that Mike is Mike, and that he wasn't going to hurt her. After the fatal stabbing, Michael called the New Jersey State Police and confessed to the crime. Local officers found him in the streets with his hands covered in blood. And in addition to his relationship with Patricia ending, Michael had recently lost his job and was struggling financially. This fact caused Carol to wonder if the stress in his life pushed him to the edge. In the end, Michael pleaded guilty to Patricia's murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And according to his lawyer, the newly convicted killer was too nervous to speak at his hearing.
13. Gana Zizina. British tech millionaire Barry Pring fell quickly in love when he met a young Ukrainian stripper named Gana Zizina in 2006. he persuaded her to leave her job with the promise to financially support her, and the couple married the following year. Pring and Zizina celebrated their first wedding anniversary over dinner in Kyiv. While awaiting a taxi outside after the meal, Zizina said that she'd left her gloves in the restaurant and rushed back inside, leaving Pring alone on the street. Witnesses would later claim that he was staggering and seemed intoxicated. Out of nowhere, a stolen car with fake license plates and no headlights fatally mowed Pring down. His family immediately suspected that Zizina had drugged Pring or was involved in his death in some way. But his body was embalmed and returned to the UK with his liver and kidneys missing, making it impossible to run a toxicology test. Within days of her husband's death, Zizina flew to Britain and tried moving into Pring's home and claiming his assets. In the meantime, Pring's family took action to stop her from cashing in and spent copious amounts of money investigating their suspicions. A private investigator discovered that a restaurant employee had offered to call a taxi for Pring and Zizina after their anniversary dinner, but Zizina had declined. During the meal, Pring had complained about a burning sensation in his chest, further pointing toward the possibility that he was poisoned. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and a judge initially ruled that Pring had been unlawfully killed after being lured into the street. But Zizina won a bid to overturn the findings and a new inquest was granted. Pring's family eventually dropped the case against Zizina, and she received a six-figure payout from her late husband's $2 million estate. 12. Rachel and Portia Lee. Ralph Range Jr. grew up working on his family's 1,200-acre tree farm in Gaston, Oregon. He never handled the business's finances and didn't fully understand how wealthy his family was or that he stood to inherit more than $10 million in assets. And despite being a kind and likable person, Rains was a socially awkward loner who never married or had kids, leaving him lonely and longing for companionship well into his 50s. In 2004, Rains visited a psychic shop in Bend, Oregon, hoping for some answers about his life and future. There he met Rachel Lee, who gave him a psychic reading. They got to talking, and Ralph confided in his new friend about how he wanted a wife and children. He also shared details about his family's business that made Lee's ears perk up. She could tell that the lifelong bachelor was worth a lot of money and began hatching a plot to inch her way into his life and get her hands on his fortune. As the friendship between Rains and Lee grew over time, so did Ralph's generosity. In 2006, he bought Lee a $915,000 house. It was a lot nicer than the ramshackle home Rains lived in. But he was a simple man, and he was so thankful for Lee's time and attention that he didn't mind spending massive sums of money on her. Later that year, Rains hired Lee to care for his father after he had a stroke, paying her nearly $9,000 a month. He also hired Lee's husband, balancing Lee to do yard work, most likely for a wildly inflated pay rate. As Lee sunk her claws further into Ralph's checkbook, she persuaded him to give her power of attorney over his money and assets, claiming that she was an experienced bookkeeper who could manage his finances. She immediately began draining his funds for her own use and bought multiple properties, including 4 psychic shops. Lee was just getting started. In 2007, she introduced Rains to her daughter Portia. It was around that time that Rains met a young British woman named Mary Marks at the Portland airport on his way home from a tree farm convention. He was instantly drawn to the young blonde, completely unaware that it was Portia Lee in a wig. She was faking the British accent and had collaborated with her mother to craft Mary Marks' persona based on Rains' description of his dream woman. In reality, Mary Marks was the name of Rachel Lee's mother. The scamming duo used it as the name for Ralph's dream girl because it enabled them to deposit money into the real Mary Marks' bank accounts and then transfer it to themselves. Mary convinced Rains that she needed someone to marry her to avoid getting deported from the United States. She drafted bogus marriage papers, which Ralph eagerly signed, and only lived with him part-time, claiming she had a job in California. Rains believed for years that the two were married, even though they were never intimate. In 2010, he signed the house which he'd bought for Lee over to Mary, which Portia then proceeded to transfer into her own name. He also forked over a continuous stream of money to the woman he believed he was married to. Rains had no idea that Mary and Rachel Lee knew each other before he introduced them. And he saw Portia Lee multiple times over the years, but never made the connection that she was Mary. The women took their scam even further when Mary told Rains she wanted to conceive a baby through in vitro fertilization. She collected a sample from Ralph, and when she turned up pregnant, he was thrilled to learn he was going to be a dad. Little did he know Mary wasn't Mary, and the baby certainly wasn't his. When the baby was born, Rains dove right into fatherhood. He loved the little boy, and he thought it was his son. To make the story even crazier than it already is, the first baby Ralph met was Portia's. But she gave custody of the child up to his real father. To keep up the ruse, she borrowed her sister's baby, who was around the same age, and used him as a cover. Portia went on to fake a pregnancy in 2012, making Ralph believe that he was going to be a father again. She wore a fake baby bump and then told Rains that she'd miscarried. Meanwhile, the Lees continued spending lavishly on luxury cars, travel, and other splurges. The scheme finally fell apart in 2014 after police saw wildly expensive cars parked outside Rachel Lee's psychic shop and became suspicious. Ralph Rains was devastated to learn that the last 7 years of his life with Mary Marks had been a lie. By then, his scammers had sold most of his tree farm, and he had just $200,000 to his name. Following an investigation, authorities charged Rachel, Portia, and Blancy Lee on a slew of charges. Rachel was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Portia received a 33-month sentence, and Blancy was handed a 2-year term. 11. Sandrine de Villard. Marcel Onfou was a recluse who spent his entire life living in a wooden shack near the French village of Puy-Saint-Pierre. Nicknamed the Hermit of the Alps, he got by without electricity or running water. Anyone who didn't know him never would have guessed that he was a multi-millionaire, but between his low-cost lifestyle and the growing value of the land he owned due to increased tourism in the region, Onfou had amassed a fortune. He could have made even more money by developing his land as a resort, but he instead filled his property with several chalets, where he let friends and family stay for free. It was perhaps only a matter of time before someone offered to buy Onfou's land. That someone was a glamorous real estate agent named Sandrine de Villard, showing up on the eccentric millionaire's doorstep in 2010. Onfou refused to sell his property, but was awestruck by de Villard's beauty and offered to take her on a date. Long story short, he fell head over heels for the blonde bombshell, and the couple married the following year. To say they were an unlikely match would be an understatement, and it carried some concerns among Onfou's loved ones about de Villard's intentions. They became even more suspicious when the couple continued to live apart after tying the knot, with de Villard remaining headquartered in Paris while Onfou stayed firmly planted in his ramshackle cabin. Just a year after marrying, the pair were in a car accident while riding with 2 of de Villard's friends. Everyone survived except Onfou. Rumors began to swirl about de Villard allegedly orchestrating her husband's death. Seemingly unconcerned by the gossip, de Villard told Onfou's friends and family that she planned to develop his property and that everyone living on it had to move. The car crash that killed Onfou was ruled an accident, and de Villard was cleared of any wrongdoing. But she soon learned that Onfou had revised his will shortly before his death, leaving everything to the very people she was trying to kick off his land. In a lawsuit, de Villard argued that the signature on the will was forged. A judge disagreed and upheld her late husband's decision to leave her empty-handed. 10. Dez Campbell. A lot of people automatically think of gold diggers as women, but that's not always the case. Former Australian police investigator Dez Campbell had a long-standing habit of living beyond his means and was constantly in debt. So he probably thought he'd hit the jackpot when he met a wealthy widow named Janet, who inherited a large sum of money after her husband died in 1997. Janet was infatuated with Campbell, who denied to others that they were in a relationship. Just a week after the clandestine couple married secretly in 2004, Janet bought a lavish home outside Sydney and bestowed nearly half of her estate to Campbell. Over the following months, Campbell had multiple affairs while continuing to deny that he and Janet were in a relationship. Meanwhile, he insulted Janet behind her back, calling her pig ugly and making it clear that he had no attraction to her whatsoever. In early 2005, Campbell took his 49-year-old wife on a camping trip to Royal National Park. Janet wasn't much of an outdoor gal, so it's safe to assume that the outing was not her idea, and that it may have even required some persuading to convince her to go. She was also afraid of heights, so it was more than a little strange that the couple pitched their tent just feet away from the edge of a 164-foot cliff. Shortly later, Campbell showed up at a police station claiming that he discovered Janet's dead body at the base of the cliff after she disappeared during a trip to the restroom. It initially seemed like a terrible tragedy, but law enforcement soon began to suspect foul play. Just a week after Janet's death, Campbell asked for access to her will. Around the same time, he skipped Janet's funeral and took one of his girlfriends on vacation. He proposed during the trip. Campbell denied allegations that he pushed Janet off the cliff in order to kill her and get his hands on her money, but a jury was unswayed by his claims of innocence and convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison and remains behind bars after unsuccessfully appealing the ruling. 9. Saki Sudo. Nicknamed the Don Juan of Kishu, Japanese billionaire Kosuke Nozaki admittedly spent millions of dollars wooing thousands of beautiful women. The 77-year-old thought he'd finally found true love when he married 22-year-old adult actress Saki Sudo in 2018. He did so despite all the warnings from his friends and family that his much younger bride was only interested in his money. Nozaki was a smart man. He noticed that Sudo preferred to spend most of her time away from home, and that she had a penchant for shopping trips in far-flung destinations like Italy and Dubai. But he was happy with the quality of her company during their limited time together, so he tolerated his wife's absences and lavish spending. The couple's newly wedded bliss was cut short just 3 months into their marriage, when Nozaki was found dead in his bathroom. A toxicology test revealed high amounts of narcotic stimulants in his system. Suspecting that Sudo was responsible for his death, police launched an investigation that would end up dragging on for nearly 3 years. Sudo reportedly wasted no time taking over her late husband's company and making plans to leave Japan. But she failed to relocate before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and her move was delayed. In the meantime, investigators uncovered a growing pile of evidence pointing toward her possible guilt in Nozaki's death, including internet searches for stimulant drugs and poisons. They also discovered that Sudo hid her marriage from family and friends in her hometown, instead telling them that she landed a high-paying job and was affording her lavish lifestyle with her own earnings. Sudo was indicted for Nozaki's murder in 2021, and the case appears to be ongoing. 8. Shiner and Charlene Foster. When a wealthy 84-year-old Manhattanite named Paul Aronson found himself wanting the company of a younger woman in 2014, he turned to a sugar daddy dating website. He connected with a young woman named Shayna Foster, who agreed to meet him for a second date if she could bring along her twin sister, Charlene. Aronson may have been thinking the more the merrier when he agreed to the plan, but instead of having twice the fun, he received a double dose of terror. After splurging on an expensive meal, the octogenarian invited the sisters to his upscale townhouse for drinks. The twins readily agreed, but unbeknownst to Aronson, they had much more sinister things on their agenda than enjoying a nightcap. Armed with zip ties, Shayna and Charlene bound Aronson to his coffee table and cleaned out his wallet, taking $500 cash and all his credit cards, then left him lying helpless on his living room floor while they went on a shopping spree. A neighbor discovered the ailing senior citizen 20 hours later. When law enforcement caught up with the Foster sisters, they reportedly claimed that Aronson made them uncomfortable and tried getting them to do things they didn't want to do. Shayna, who took the heat for the crime and admitted to being the mastermind, described Aronson as ugly, old, and disgusting. She even went as far as saying that he deserved what happened to him. Shalene's lawyer claimed that his client only watched her as her sister carried out the robbery. Authorities charged both twins in connection with the incident. Shayna took a plea deal and admitted to 1 count of robbery in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. The court agreed that Shayna was the primary actor in the plot and allowed Charlene to plead guilty to robbery in exchange for a prison sentence of 1 1/3 to 4 years. 7. Stacy Mendoza. While working as a waitress at a restaurant in Hanford, California in 2018, 38-year-old Stacy Mendoza befriended a lonely Vietnam War veteran in his 70s named Kenneth Coyle. She spent the next several months gaining his trust and access to his bank account, which she began siphoning money from the moment the opportunity arose. One day, in April 2018, Mendoza and her husband Jose went to Coyle's home, where they restrained, beat, and tortured him until he gave them his banking passwords. The couple then bludgeoned and suffocated the victim to death. A few days later, the Mendozas rented a U-Haul and loaded Coyle's body into it. They drove to a rural area and burned the remains while their 3 children watched. Coyle's charred remains were found among a pile of garbage and several of his belongings in the abandoned U-Haul at the burn site, leading investigators to believe that the killers tried to disguise the scene as a trash dump. After burning Coyle's body, the couple returned to his house to steal more of his belongings and to try obtaining the deed to his property. While they were there, a property manager spotted the couple and called the police, who tracked the pair down at a restaurant in Los Angeles. Authorities intervened just in time to stop Jose Mendoza from boarding a flight to El Salvador. Following an investigation, Hanford Police Captain Carl Anderson told the Hanford Sentinel that the Mendozas had done extensive research on the best ways to get their hands on Coyle's money, including the possibility of becoming his power of attorney. They apparently decided that killing him was the easiest route. Stacy Mendoza was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The outcome of Jose's case is unclear. 6. Shirley Casara. After being widowed twice by the age of 55, Eldon Bowen longed for lasting companionship. In 2003, he met a church-going woman 8 years his senior named Shirley Inez Casara. At just 4 feet 11 inches tall and with a soft-spoken grandmotherly demeanor, Shirley hardly seemed like someone to fear. She'd been married 3 times, but Eldon didn't see this as a red flag after hearing about how Shirley's past husbands had mistreated her. Shirley and Eldon married in 2004 after a whirlwind romance and settled down in Virginia. It wasn't long before Shirley asked her new husband to put her name on the deed to his house, which Eldon was happy to do. He also gave Shirley access to his bank accounts. Eldon later told the ID channel show, Who the Bleep Did I Marry?, that Shirley's personality changed overnight roughly 2 months into the marriage. She became constantly angry and began calling Eldon names, insulting him and picking arguments with him on a regular basis. At first, Eldon assumed Shirley was having a bad day whenever she lashed out at him. But it began happening too often to overlook, especially as Shirley's temper reached new extremes. During an argument one day, she stormed out of the house. Eldon went outside a little later and discovered that someone had keyed his truck. A few weeks later, Shirley called 911 and falsely accused Eden of hitting her. She allegedly showed officers a self-inflicted wound and blamed it on her husband. Eldon was arrested and called his son to bail him out. He discovered later that evening that his checking account had been emptied. A bank employee revealed that Shirley had withdrawn all the money the day before she had Eldon arrested. The situation worsened when the judge overseeing the domestic violence case granted Shirley a 2-year restraining order, banning Eldon from going anywhere near his own home. With her husband out of the picture, Shirley got rid of all his belongings. Eldon filed for divorce, but Shirley refused to sign the papers. Meanwhile, she began barraging her estranged husband with harassing and threatening phone calls, which Eldon did his best to ignore. One day he answered the phone, and Shirley filed a police report against him for violating the protective order. After hearing rumors that Shirley planned to marry another man, Eldon investigated her background and discovered that she had in fact remarried while their divorce was still pending. She'd also married Eldon while still married to her previous husband. A police investigation found that several of Shirley's past marriages had overlapped, and she had been married not 4 times like Eldon thought, but 10 times. He was her 8th husband. Several of Shirley's past husbands told eerily similar stories of being falsely accused of abuse and drained of their money and assets. In 2010, authorities charged Shirley with embezzlement, bigamy, and fraud. She became known among locals as the gold-digging grandma and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. 5. Angelina Rodriguez. 41-year-old U.S. military veteran Frank Rodriguez met his future wife, 32-year-old Angela, while working at a boot camp for wayward youth in San Luis Obispo, California. He was instantly smitten with the single mother, who'd also served in the armed forces. The couple married in April 2000, just months after meeting, leaving their friends and family shocked. It was Frank's 2nd marriage and Angelina's 4th. Frank was a quiet church-going man who was quick to trust others. Prosecutors would later argue that these traits made him an easy target for Angelina, who had a checkered history of jumping from one relationship to the next and chasing after money and attention. She was also a habitual liar, according to friends and family, including one relative who told the Los Angeles Times that Angelina went as far as faking a pregnancy and a miscarriage before she met Frank. After the wedding, Frank took a job as a school teacher. He didn't make the kind of money Angelina was after, and he was worth more dead than alive after Angelina took out a $250,000 life insurance policy on him shortly into the marriage. Friends would later tell the court that Angelina talked about how she should just kill Frank and get it over with so that she could receive the payout. At the time, they assumed it was a distasteful but harmless joke. A few months after the couple tied the knot, Frank fell mysteriously ill. Plagued by an excruciating headache and unable to keep food down, he visited the emergency room twice. Each time, doctors told Frank that it was food poisoning and to go home and just rest it off. He died in September of 2000, just 4 months into the marriage. The cause of Frank's death was a mystery. His body showed no injuries and a standard toxicology test turned up no evidence of poisoning. Unable to collect on Frank's health insurance until a cause of death was determined, Angelina tipped authorities off with her suspicion that a vengeful co-worker poisoned her husband during a recent outing. Everyone police interviewed seemed truly distraught over Frank's death, including the co-worker Angelina had accused of poisoning him. Back at square one and now suspicious of Angelina, investigators befriended the widow and made her think that they saw her as an ally who was helping them to get to the bottom of her husband's suspicious death. Acting on information from Angelina herself and Frank's sister, the medical examiner found traces of a poisonous flower called oleander in his body, along with a deadly amount of ethylene glycol, better known as antifreeze. Meanwhile, the growing stack of evidence against Angelina was largely circumstantial but abundant. She was having an affair, had complained to friends about being bored with Frank, and had tried leading detectives on a wild goose chase as if to distract them from focusing on her. In February 2001, police confronted Angelina with proof that she had told them multiple lies. After learning that her allegations against Frank's co-worker had been disproven, she tried to claim that her husband must have taken his own life. She stubbornly insisted that she had nothing to do with Frank's death, but was hauled off to jail on suspicion of first-degree murder. During her trial, the court heard about Angelina's sordid past, including evidence suggesting that she may have killed one of her own children and blamed the manufacturer of the child's pacifier. She received a $750,000 settlement in that case. The jury convicted Angelina of first-degree murder and she was sentenced to death. With executions in California currently halted due to a statewide moratorium, it looks as though the death penalty may be abolished, in which case her sentence would be commuted to life in prison. She continues to maintain her innocence to this day. 4. Pamela Ann Phillips. Gary Triano was a highly successful real estate developer from Tucson, Arizona, who ran in social circles with other millionaires including Donald Trump. After playing a round of golf at an upscale country club one afternoon in 1996, the twice-divorced father of 5 got into a Lincoln Town car that he was borrowing from a friend. The car instantly exploded, blowing him to pieces just days before his 53rd birthday and sending debris dozens of yards across the parking lot. Police identified the weapon as a remote-controlled pipe bomb that was most likely activated by someone in the parking lot as they watched Gary get into his car. It also seemed likely that Gary's murder was masterminded by someone who knew him personally and was aware of his routine. But Gary knew a lot of people and wasn't hard to find, so this didn't necessarily make it any easier to track down his killer. Someone had called the country club and asked if Gary was there that day, but investigators didn't know who the caller was. Considering the amount of money Gary was worth and his business ties with casinos, the murder quickly sparked rumors of a mob hit. A closer look at his finances revealed that he had lost a massive amount of money in recent years due to bad business dealings. He was up to his eyeballs in debt and had declared bankruptcy 2 years before his death. Despite being financially tapped out and owing money to a lot of people, there was no evidence that anyone was angry enough to kill Gary. Detectives began to focus on his personal life and quickly eliminated 2 out of the 3 women he had children with. In the process, they learned that his second wife, Pamela Phillips, had divorced him in 1994 after he went broke, because he could no longer afford the lavish lifestyle she demanded. Rumors long swirled about Pam being a homewrecker who'd interfered with Gary's first marriage and was only after his money. When the marriage between Gary and Pam ended after 7 years, Pam moved to Aspen, Colorado. The former couple began to fight bitterly over money, with Pam accusing Gary of hiding assets and demanding higher child support payments. She was a successful real estate entrepreneur in her own right, but it apparently wasn't enough to uphold her taste for the finer things in life. While shopping around Aspen in search of a new husband, Pam met a man named Ronald Young. He wasn't rich, but he had business management skills, and he offered to help Pam develop her website, which revolved around horoscopes for babies. As the friendship between Pam and Ronald grew close, Gary began to worry that someone was following and keeping tabs on him. When his girlfriend asked why, he reportedly mentioned a $2 million life insurance policy that listed his 2 children with Pam as the beneficiaries. Because the kids were under 18, the money would go to Pam if he died. Pam had a rock-solid alibi for her whereabouts on the day of Gary's murder, which ruled her out as the actual killer. But investigators were highly suspicious of her connection with Young, who had a track record for stealing his client's credit. Shortly before the bombing, a van rented by Young was found abandoned in California with papers detailing Pam and Gary's divorce and a sawed-off shotgun. Further investigation indicated that Pam had agreed to pay Young $400,000 for killing Gary, which she wired to him in installments. Even more suspiciously, Young had fled to Colorado after Gary's murder and was nowhere to be found. He was picked up in Florida on forgery and embezzlement charges in 2005 after being featured on America's Most Wanted, and was charged with Gary's murder 3 years later. In 2009, authorities captured Pam in Vienna, Austria, and extradited her back to the US to face murder and conspiracy charges. Ronald Young, was found guilty of murder in 2010 and is serving 2 consecutive life terms. 4 years later, and 18 years after Gary's death, Pamela Phillips was also convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without parole. She continues to maintain her innocence from behind bars. 3. Bibu Prakash Swain. By all outward appearances, Bibu Prakash Swain had little to offer a bride. He was in his 60s, overweight, and 5'2". Yet he managed to scam at least 27 women throughout India over a period of many years. Using marriage websites, he posed as an esteemed 51-year-old college professor, a doctor, and a high-earning government-appointed medical expert. Swain targeted intelligent women over the age of 40 who had good jobs. His victims included a high-ranking border patrol agent, an accountant, several teachers, a doctor, 2 Supreme Court advocates, and several government employees. To reel the women in, Swain preyed on the societal pressure they felt to find a husband. Speaking to the Hindustan Times, sociologist Rita Ray explained that Indian culture frowns upon unmarried women, who are often considered an economic burden to their families, and that it creates a perceived obligation to get married. In some cases, victims noticed that Swain looked older than he claimed to be. They overlooked it in consideration of all he claimed he had to offer, which included offers to help their kids get into medical school. One woman who married Swain in 2018 was both shocked and suspicious when Swain began leaving the home for months at a time, claiming he was out of town on business. Someone tipped her off to Swain's many other marriages, and like several of the other women who were being scammed, she left. She also launched a complaint with law enforcement in 2021, and an investigation ensued. Detectives uncovered evidence that Swain took large amounts of gold jewelry and cash from his wives, including valuables that the woman's family had taken out high-interest loans to pay for, in the good faith belief that their daughter was marrying a doctor. He also developed a habit of calling his wives and claiming that he was stranded at an airport due to a cancelled flight and that he needed money to get home. In some cases, Swain would call a victim up with a story about a sudden illness, claiming he needed money to pay for medical treatment. He promised to repay the money, but never did. He also had a long history of committing different types of fraud, including a credit card scam in 2006 that involved using 128 credit cards to fool 13 different banks. While following Swain's trail, investigators discovered that he was traveling all over the country to keep up his relationships in what authorities have described as India's biggest ever marriage scam. After establishing Swain's pattern of movement, law enforcement got one step ahead of him and waited for his predicted arrival in the city of Bhubaneswar. Police finally nabbed him in early 2022, and the case appears to be ongoing. 2. Ann McDonald. Self-made millionaire Rich McDonald owned a pest control business in Marin, California, which he ran with the help of his wife, 56-year-old Ann. The couple both had expensive taste and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, which included a yacht club membership, an upscale home in one of the nation's wealthiest suburbs, and a place among society's elite social circles. But the marriage wasn't as blissful as it seemed on the surface. Rich was Ann's 5th husband, and by 1991 she'd gotten bored with him and was having an affair with another man named Al Brownberger. She felt secondary to Rich's preoccupation with the yacht club, and while Al didn't make much money and was a failed businessman, he gave Ann the attention she craved and wasn't getting at home. Suspecting his wife was cheating on him, Rich hired a private investigator. After having his suspicions confirmed, Al was brutally attacked. Ann and Al ran off to Arizona, but Ann returned after Rich cut off her access to money. One day, Ann dialed 911 and reported that her husband had been brutally beaten to death. Police immediately suspected her of being involved after learning of the couple's troubled marriage. They theorized that Ann had Rich killed because it was the only way she thought she could get away from him without being cut off financially. Old-fashioned detective work led authorities to 35-year-old Manuel Martinez, who admitted under the condition of immunity that he was paid $35,000 to kill Rich McDonald. He told investigators that Anne and Al told him to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Both Anne and Al were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Anne died behind bars from natural causes in 2013 at the age of 79. Martinez avoided any punishment thanks to his immunity agreement, and his accomplice, Larry Smith, served 2 years in prison. 1. Ashley Benefield. 24-year-old former ballerina and bikini model Ashley Byers met Navy veteran and successful businessman Doug Benefield at a Republican Party fundraiser in Palm Beach, Florida in 2016. Although Doug was more than 30 years older than Ashley, the chemistry was there, and the two married less than 2 weeks later. Ashley quickly became pregnant and moved to Florida to live with her mum, while Doug stayed behind in South Carolina. His daughter, Eva, would later tell the court that this was when the first signs surfaced of the marriage being in trouble. Doug, nevertheless, wanted to help his new wife achieve her dreams, so he financed the startup of Ashley's ballet company, the American National Ballet. But it didn't last for long, because Doug ran into business problems and began to hemorrhage money, causing the ballet company to fall apart. The couple began to fight bitterly amid their newfound money issues and cheating allegations, and Ashley filed for divorce in 2020. But a divorce wouldn't be necessary, because Doug was shot dead inside Ashley's mother's home in Lakewood Ranch, Florida one September afternoon. Police arrived to find him lying on a bedroom floor with multiple bullet wounds. Ashley claimed she shot her husband in self-defense, but quickly lawyered up and refused to answer questions. Law enforcement concluded that all signs pointed toward Ashley killing Doug in cold blood. According to an affidavit, Doug's gunshot wounds indicated that Doug wasn't even facing Ashley when she pulled the trigger. Furthermore, a neighbor reportedly told police that there were no signs of injury to Ashley. No torn clothing, bruises, cuts, or anything else. Authorities charged her with second-degree murder. For many, the questions that remain are whether Ashley married Doug for money, and if she killed him because the money ran out. She continues to maintain her innocence under Florida's Stand Your Ground law and is scheduled for her next court hearing in July 2023.
If you were about to have the worst day you've had in years, would you want to know about it ahead of time, or would you rather just deal with it as it comes? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one. Bye.